Hey, lovely readers, and welcome back to another chapter reaction with Christine E. Schulze, your favorite elfish author. And today we're going to be reading another selection from one of the books that I've written. So this won't be a reaction on my part today because I've obviously read it before because I wrote it. But y'all can tell me your reactions down in the comments after I read it. And we're going to be reading another selection from the Stregoni Sequence, but today we're going to be delving into a selection from Memory Charmer, which is the second book in the trilogy. Now, one thing I didn't mention in my first video about the Stregoni Sequence is that if you wish to purchase these books separately, they are all available separately. The reason that I like to show the complete trilogy is because I just think it's really pretty. I'm very happy and pleased with how the cover compilation turned out. And, it's just, I like all-in-one, so I think that they're really nice to have an all-in-one collection of, like, one of your favorite series. But yeah, the books are available both print and ebook, as separate books or as an all-in-one, whatever your preference is. But yeah, we're gonna go ahead and dive into this. As you can see, I got my Zelda shirt today. Got the Zelda map puzzle, which was the worst puzzle I've ever put together ever. But well worth it, on the wall behind me. A lot of my writings are, especially my earlier writings, are inspired by Zelda, it being my favorite gaming series. And in fact, coming up on the channel, I'm going to be reading to you guys a fanfic that I actually wrote. A Zelda fanfic that I wrote, a few years ago. It has to do with Skyward Sword, in a way, and since Skyward Sword just got re-released, I figured perfect timing, right? So that'll be coming up in a little bit, probably in a couple weeks or so. But yeah, we're gonna jump into this. If I could find the first page, maybe the best thing would be to actually use my own table of contents. Hold up. Memory Charmer, page 105. Now, for those of you who maybe didn't see my first video on this series, that's okay, you can go back and watch it. I will, just as a reminder, this series is comprised of different stories in which different magical beings, such as vampires, genies, fairies, elves, whom I've given like my own unique twist on, are trapped inside some kind of magical spell that needs to be broken. So in this one, in Memory Charmer, you have a young gentleman who is trapped inside a spell that I honestly don't even want to comment too much on, because I don't really want to give anything away. There are some characters that come into play from the first book in the series, but this first chapter, that's right, the first part is just called part 1. There's not even chapters, this is a short intro here. But the first part in this story, in this book, Memory Charmer, is about completely new characters, and those characters will end up intertwining with some of the characters that we met in the first book. So yeah, we're gonna go ahead, we're gonna get started with the Stregoni Sequence, book 2, Memory Charmer, and we're gonna go ahead and jump into part 1, which is called The Boy Next Door. The basement was completely finished, so it didn't matter that he hardly ever allowed her upstairs. Living downstairs with the butterfly and celestial decorations scattered in an artsy, mismatched sort of way was like dwelling in her own private, personalized home, a special corner of the house all to herself. But it wasn't a home. It was a prison. She stood very still against the doorframe, taking shallow breaths. Edging as close as possible to the doorway without being seen, she remained motionless and silent as a shadow, listening to the voices at the top of the stairs. He, the musician, spoke with the new family in his song-like, alluring voice. He often rented out the extra cottage on his land, and finally, after so many months, he had found a new, interested family. Why he had chosen them of all people, she could not tell. His house, as well as his extra cottage, stood several miles from the capital of Liselite, heavily secluded deep in the woods. Shadows and secrets shrouded his life, and he preferred it that way. So, why did he rent the house to the one family who knew his most kept secret? Her existence in the basement. The boy. The boy knew. The boy had caught a glimpse of her through the window, on the day she had left the blinds open. How could she have been so foolish? How angry the musician had been upon finding out. Though not present at the time, He had still known. He always knew things, like how the boy had stared, trying to catch a better look at her through the window, perhaps trying to understand what she was. Her long, dark blue curls and fair blue skin were certainly a strange appearance to anyone who was new to the area and unfamiliar with the forest peoples. After that incident, the musician had neither spoken nor acted harshly toward her again. At least, she didn't think he had. She stifled a frustrated sigh, fearful of making the slightest sound. Remembering anything at all was so difficult. She wasn't sure whether this was the work of the musician's magic house or of his own dark magic. At any rate, she somehow knew that he often manipulated her mind. She wasn't sure how she knew, but she did. He robbed her of memories of things that he had done, memories he perhaps thought too horrible for her to remember. Her memories snatched away, she could only trust her feelings. Yet, that could be worse. Feelings of guilt, shame, and fear lingering in her heart without having any clue why. She formed suspicions, yet she dared not let those fully take shape in her mind either. Sometimes she already felt on the brink of madness from not knowing why such strong feelings shrouded her heart and clouded her mind. Well, she did know in part. It was because the musician was there, always waiting for whatever it was he expected of her. If only she could remember, even though something in the back of her mind urged her not to remember, as it was too horrible. "Yes, well, I'm very glad to do business with you, sir," the musician said then to the father of the family. "I'm sure you'll enjoy your summer stay at the cottage. The forest is gorgeous this time of year." She shuddered, fearing and praying that the new family might not do anything against his pleasing. After all, such beautiful trees and flowers had been known to grow suddenly poisonous or worse when past renters did something to dissatisfy him. "And thank you, sir," the father returned. "My family and I look forward to a relaxing vacation here in Lieselite. I can think of no better place for you to have come. Thank you again, sir, for all your hospitality." "Certainly. May I see you and your family to the door?" Footsteps sounded above. She tried to quiet her already shallow breath even more. "Wait." Her heart skipped a beat as the boy spoke. It must be his voice, for it sounded younger but similar to his father's, slightly deep, just on the borderline of morphing from a boy's into a man's. "Sir, if I may ask, I saw a girl through your window one day. I apologize for spying, only I was hoping there might be someone my age I could play with." "Ah, my cousin, Alyssa. Yes, she visits her sometimes, but I'm afraid she won't be back till next summer, young man." Her heart trembled again. Why did he give the boy her real name? What a pity. She was very pretty and... The boy's speech abruptly stopped. She imagined a sharp look from the boy's father and could have laughed, under different circumstances. More polite words of parting were exchanged. The footsteps faded, and the door closed. Silence, and waiting. Fleeing to her room, she sat on the bed, stiff, frightened, waiting. Waiting for what? She always felt like she was waiting and fearing, though she never knew why. She just couldn't remember. The silence deafened, until the soft thud of footsteps shattered that quiet with their symbolical thunder. Her fear intensified. The one thing she knew was that those footsteps were the musician's. He was coming closer, closer, closer. And then he stood in her doorway, smiling, his perfectly calm, bright green eyes twinkling at her. He stood with a tall, quietly proud stance, tucking his shoulder-length blonde hair behind one ear before casually crossing his arms. He looked so perfect, but she knew by now that that perfection was a facade. "Well, sweetheart, we've done it. We've rented out the cottage." "Good for you," she said quietly. "I think this calls for a bit of a celebration, don't you?" He walked forward slowly. She focused her gaze straight at the blank wall ahead, keeping perfectly still and poised, hands crossed in her lap. "Don't you?" The musician hovered right over her, casting an ominous shadow. Suddenly, she knew the reason for her fear, even though she still couldn't properly remember. She didn't need to remember. He was the living nightmare. He was fear itself. He was power and strength and control and desire. He cupped her face in his hands, forcing her gaze to meet his. At first, he touched her gently, a false gentleness. She began to tremble, and he stroked her hair. Then, his grasp tightened, and she was only weakness and fear and loss of all control. She needed no memory as this fear, so old and yet so new all at once, overtook her once more. He held her face firmly in his hands, and his gaze burned deeply into hers. As his magic emanated from his body into hers, she felt her energy slowly slipping away. She grew weaker and weaker as he forced it from her like the greediest incubus. As he drained her energy, a burning, intolerable pain ensnared her, gripped every fiber of her being, and yet he had bewitched her so that she could neither cry out nor move an inch. She felt like she would explode inside, and yet she could do nothing to relieve it herself. Even though she couldn't remember the last time, she knew what was to come next. She knew she would pass out soon, the pain too much to bear. She screamed loudly within her mind as the pain overwhelmed, and then all went black. She lay on her back, staring at the white ceiling. If only her mind could become just as empty. What bliss it must be to feel absolutely nothing. She knew what had happened, even if she couldn't remember anything but him standing in her doorway and approaching with hungry eyes. She used to be unable to remember even that much, but maybe she was growing a bit immune to his magic, or maybe he just no longer cared as much about concealing the truth. Why did he use magic to make her forget anyway? He had grown lazy enough to no longer prevent the throbbing headaches caused by his magic. Was he so warped as to think himself a noble kidnapper by making her forget all the torturous things he did to her? Or did he realize the extra power he wielded in seizing her memories and instilling that fear of the unknown? For though she had some clue of how he tortured her mind, she could never be entirely certain of what went on between them. Sometimes she felt glad she didn't know. Other times, she thought knowing might make the overwhelming fears more bearable. Unable to sleep, as always after he had visited her, she sat up, slipped silently from bed, and made her way down the hall. She paused before passing in front of the doorway leading upstairs. Though she knew he was likely asleep in his bedroom upstairs at the far end of the cottage, she always paused here to listen for his snoring, just to be sure. Upon hearing it, she stole past the doorway and tiptoed up to the sliding glass door leading from the living room out into the backyard. She opened the door very slowly, and just enough to slip through before closing it behind her. She deeply inhaled the cool night air. The gentle, sweet scent of the small moon blossom bush wafted up to her. This was the one place where she could feel safe and free, if only for a little while. A place so close to the house, yet it seemed so far away. Tall stone walls surrounded the backyard on all three sides, but the back wall was constructed of 2 tiers so that she could have easily climbed out. Not that she'd get far. She'd tried that only once, and the consequences had proved severe. His guard, a giant tarantula, had appeared from nowhere and scooped her up in large, hairy legs, its cruel fangs gleaming at her. It had wrapped all but her head in strong, unbreakable spider silk and strung her from the single tree in the backyard. Then the beast had just stood there, watching. She had never been more terrified in her entire life. At least, not until the musician had strolled out. He had walked with his usual calm, proud gait, but such a fury had shone in his eyes like none she'd ever seen. "You're dismissed, Nargog," he'd hissed. Shrinking to the size of an ordinary house spider, the guard had crawled into the depths of the tree's branches. The musician had cut her down from the tree with a swipe of his hand, as if wielding an invisible sword. After she'd fallen roughly to the ground, he'd released her bonds, all except her hands, which he kept bound together firmly with the spider silk. He'd knelt low over her then, his golden hair brushing her face, his eyes like deep, unbearable shadows as he hissed, "May that teach you not to defy me ever again. If you do, I will let him do much worse to you. Have you learned your lesson?" She had nodded, shaking all over, unable to say anything, knowing somehow what was coming. "No," he had whispered, his voice low, menacing, almost like a growl. "I don't think you quite have." Closing her eyes, she placed a hand upon her yet dully throbbing head. She didn't want to remember what had happened after he had spoken those words, nor the way his voice had tingled on her neck like a deceptively gentle breeze before the most furious of storms. Running her fingers along the bark of the immense tree, she glanced up at the branches, something she did now out of mere habit. After that night, she had stared upon the tree in terrified paranoia many nights before realizing that the spider's only purpose was to assure she did not escape. Unless she tried to do so again, he would not appear. She sat upon the lower tier of the back wall. How frustrating to be so close to freedom and yet know that if she dared climb a few more steps, she would be caught, punished, and imprisoned all over again. She gasped and froze rigid as she heard the leaves rustle. Her gaze snapped immediately to the tree, but it lay still. Her glance skirted then to the trees and bushes above, along the top of the wall. The woods surrounded the house very closely. One of the bushes moved, and then, whoa! She sprang up as someone fell, toppling over the bushes and the wall, and landed hard, face down inside the yard. Racing over, she knelt beside him with a gasp. It was the boy who had spied her through the window, who had spoken so boldly to the musician today. The boy sat up on his knees, groaning. "Are you all right?" she asked, reaching out her hand, wanting very much to touch him, but then hesitating. Already her gaze roamed nervously about the yard, to the second-story window. What if he had heard when the boy fell? What would he do to the boy? Sure, I'm..." The boy stopped to stare at her. "It's you," he said. "You're Mr. Crowder's cousin." She smiled dryly, helping him to his feet. "He's not my cousin." "He's not?" the boy asked. wincing as he hopped up to sit up beside her on the stone wall. "No," she said, and then, wishing she had kept silent about it, "Look, are you okay? That was quite a fall." "Just bruised, I think. But if he's not your cousin, then what are you?" "His ward," she answered darkly. "His ward," he said slowly. "What's that supposed to mean? I thought there was something weird going on here." She studied him. Concern shone in his eyes now. Whatever he was, besides incredibly handsome with his dark hair and dark eyes that twinkled as though stars shone within them, he certainly wasn't stupid. The boy's gaze narrowed, and a frown tightened his lips. "What has he done to you?" "Why do you care so much?" she whispered. "You could get yourself in so much trouble, and you don't even know me." He smiled. "I've watched you more than once, you know. I know you better than you think." She was unsure whether or not to be angry by such an invasion of privacy. First the musician, now this boy. He continued, "There was a time I watched you at your window, but mostly I watch you when you come here in the backyard. You always look so lost and longing, like you don't quite know who you are or where you belong. But you don't belong here, and you want nothing more than to leave. The first night I saw you, you were crying, and so I kept coming back to check on you. I wanted to talk to you, but I didn't know if that would cause more trouble for you than whatever trouble you already had. But now, here I am, and I suppose if my fall didn't wake him up." Taking the boy's hand, she assured him quietly, yet with all the meaning in the world, "Even if he did hear, it's worth it to me, I promise you." Realizing what she had done, she quickly tried to recoil her hand. In a flash, she snatched it back, holding it gently but securely. "It's okay. I understand. You've been waiting for so long for someone to reach out to, someone to touch, anything that shows that anyone truly cares, that your life isn't just a vain waste of time in this house." Her breath quickened as she stared into his eyes. It was as though he spoke not only directly to her heart, but from it. How could he understand her so well? As if reading her thoughts, he smiled broadly. "I too have been lonely a long time." "But at least you have your parents," she said quietly. He shook his head. "They're not." She stared at him, silently prompting him to elaborate. "Not my parents," he said. She frowned, even more perplexed. "Well, that makes two of us with a secret." "You're right." He sighed. "And I owe you an explanation after the risk I'm putting you through in being here. Besides, it's not as though I think you'll tell my secret to anyone." She laughed softly. "No one to tell except the spiders." He nodded and smiled back. "All right. Well, the three of us were sent here, to the below of Liselite." "The below?" "Patience, I'm getting to it. Yes, you see, all three of us, we're from the above, from the sky, because, well, there's no careful way to put this, so I just come right out with it. We're stars. We're all three of us stars." She stared skeptically, almost wanting to laugh at how ridiculous his words sounded. "Stars?" she echoed. "You mean, like, twinkling stars? Shooting stars? Stars in the sky?" "Stars, yes." He admitted it so matter-of-factly, with no hint of deceit on his face, that she assumed he must be telling the truth, or else he was just mad enough to believe that he did. Either way, his intention was not to deceive her. "But how?" She shook her head, trying to fathom the possibility of such nonsense. "How did you get down here? To the below, as you call it?" He shrugged. "Just as you said, by becoming shooting stars. That's what a shooting star is, you know. A star traveling to the below." He explained it all so casually that she could only stare all the more. If he was just toying with her, he certainly hit it skillfully. Bizarre as it was, she found herself already beginning to believe him. Perhaps because she had had no one to believe in for so long, and perhaps she was a fool to do so now. But somehow she couldn't help it with him. "Well, why are you here then?" she asked. "In the below, I mean." "We're looking for a new knight," he said. When she continued to gaze in total confusion, he sighed deeply and said, "Sorry, all of this is so common to me that I can forget what mortals like yourself don't know. Let me try to explain. See, I'm sure you've heard the legends of Bienvenette being an elemental land. That means it's governed and protected by elemental guardians. None of this is legend. It is all true, and the knight we have now, she's dying, fast. If she dies, and there's no more knight, you can imagine the confusion and trouble that would cause for the inhabitants of Bienvenette, and we stars would have to sleep forever. So several of us stars were sent to the below to search for a new knight. Because there's only two ways for a new elemental to be chosen. Either one of their children must become their successor, or else an elemental must marry a mortal, and that mortal can then also become an elemental. Night has no children to inherit her crown and responsibilities, so that leaves things to those of us seeking companionship. Several of us came down seeking a wife, or husband as the case may be. Whoever finds a willing companion can then appoint him or her as the new knight." And, this current night, how much time does she have left? He shook his head. Hard to say exactly. We've been searching for a couple of weeks, but now I'd say a few days at best. That's why we have to hurry. If we don't find a new night soon, then once the current night is no more, the stars will all sleep, and then who will find the new night? Day and sun won't do it, as they'll be glad to have total reign of the sky. Wind is so concerned in her own affairs, and she's too childish and playful for marriage yet, I think. Moon might be able to do it, I guess. Still, we're hoping that with several of the stars searching, someone will find her, or him, he added quickly, glancing away. He stared intently at her up to this point, and now she felt glad that, whoever this night was, her darkness concealed her blushing. She knew what he was thinking, what he had implied, and felt suddenly very shy in his presence. But then she began to think. It would have seemed a bold suggestion, even absurd since they had just met, but now that she understood his situation, it didn't seem so. Accepting his offer might really not be so bad. Already they shared some connection in that they were both lonely, seeking companionship. He certainly seemed sincere, and even if he wasn't, if he really took her to the sky, at least she'd be far away from the musician. Becoming knight sounded like a huge responsibility, yet wasn't that also what she had been hoping for? To discover some purpose besides just the daily survival she'd come to call living? Maybe this was meant to be. Maybe Amiel had heard her prayers at last, and this opportunity was his answer. Her hand crept along the wall to take his as she dared to whisper, "I'm willing to do it, you know. If you can get me out of here, if you can save me from him, I'll save you and the other stars." His gaze widened and met hers. He seemed to study her uncertainly, cautiously, but with a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "Are you sure? I understand it's really weird because we just met." She smiled. "It's me who should be telling you that. It's probably the reaction all the other stars will be getting in looking for spouses, you know." He nodded. "You have a point. But why do you... Don't you think I'd risk everything to get away from this? From him?" Her voice trailed to a whisper as she spoke of the musician, and she glanced away, not wanting the boy to see her pain. He squeezed her hand, promising, "I'm not like that, you know. Like him. I would never want you to be terrified of me like that, or make you do anything you don't want. I want to do this." She looked up at him again, surprising herself with the confidence in her voice. "This may be the only chance I have to escape, but..." She cast an uneasy glance at the tree. "What is it?" he whispered, as if sensing the abrupt need for quiet. "I tried to escape once before," she breathed. "He caught me almost instantly." "If you were knight, you'd possess new powers, speed being one of them, and then there would be my speed as well as a star. Only you'd have to agree to become knight before we left here, because only knight has the power to return the stars to the above, and returning the above is the only way we could truly escape." "I agree," she said with a nod. "Then I will send word to our current knight, and then I will return for you tomorrow. We'll have to perform the wedding and appointment ceremonies right here. I'll bring the 2 other stars as witnesses." He stopped short and laughed. "What is it?" she asked, smiling as his eyes danced. "I just realized. You just accepted a marriage proposal from a man whose name you don't even know." She chuckled. "I must be more desperate than I thought." He laughed again, and the laughter shone in his starlit eyes. "Well, Lady Alyssa, that is your real name?" She nodded. "Well, Lady Alyssa, 'tis an honor to meet you. I'm James Starr, but you can call me James, of course." Knowing his name filled her with a smile from the inside out. "James." He nodded. "Well then, my lady, I must needs be off until tomorrow. There's much to discuss with the other stars, much to plan. I'll return for you here tomorrow night." She nodded, and he stood on the inner wall, helping her to her feet. As they stood close, an unusual heat blazed from his skin. His gaze burned brightly and deeply into hers, setting her heart aflame with a promise he need not speak. He would return, for a new ember already grew in his gleaming eyes, a spark of new affection for the one he had chosen as his wife. He leaned his face toward hers. She placed a finger to his lips, stopping him. "Not here," she whispered. "If he sees..." "Let him see," he said fearlessly, and a thrill raced through her. "Soon he will not be able to stand against your power, when you are knight." "But I am not yet," she reminded gently. "No," he shook his head, "but soon, and then I may kiss you every night, if it so pleases you." She smiled. "It would please me very much." Till tomorrow, then," he promised, kissing her hand. With a final reassuring look, he scaled the wall, sprinting noiselessly into the woods. For a moment, she could only stare at the place where he had disappeared. He had gone as quickly as he'd come. Was it all real? Was James Starr real? Did he really promise to take her away from the torture that was her existence? Was his promise truly sincere? Even if it wasn't, the hope he had given her was enough to allow her to sleep through one more night here. She hopped down from the wall, casting a wary glance at the tree as she passed by, wondering if the spider slept, if it acted as a spy or just as a guard. Hopefully, his only purpose was to keep her in, not others out. Slipping inside, she locked the door and crept back to her room, snuggling beneath the covers. This time, sleep came easily to her. Her heart, stricken with the coldness of fear for far too long, at last nestled in secure warmth as she thought of James Starr. She would soon dance in his arms, in the sky, far from where anyone could harm her ever again. And that was the end of our selection today for Memory Charmer from the Stregoni Sequence. Lots of questions to ask already. Will Alyssa be able to escape with James Starr and become the new knight and escape whatever the heck is going on with the musician? We know that he tortures her mind but also steals her memory. What the heck? Yeah, so normally I understand a lot of people aren't into insta-love, and I can't say that I necessarily am either. But, dire circumstances cause for dire measures. She's gonna marry this guy, and she has literally probably hundreds and hundreds of years as an elemental to get to know him and learn to love him. You could raise the question, well, why doesn't he just rescue her normally? But the truth is, he's a star, and he's gonna have to get back to the heavens before the old knight dies, or else he's gonna be forced to sleep forever. So really, marrying her, making her a star, making her a knight, and getting her to the sky is really the only way for him to really rescue her. So yeah, in this case, it is a bit of a, maybe we don't want to call it insta-love. I don't think they're in love yet, but insta-romance, insta-relationship. But pretty exciting. I really love the beginning of this book, which I don't say to be vain. I know it is my book, but I just really love the beginning, the introduction with Alyssa and James Starr, and the whole concept of the elementals. We're going to meet a lot of the other elementals that were hinted at in here, including, I don't think he mentioned, there's cloud, wind, earth, river, fire. Yeah, we're going to meet more elemental beings that watch over this land of Bienvenette, and just see their powers, and also see how they're interconnected to some of our characters from book 1 in the Stregoni Sequence. But yeah, that about wraps up our video for today. Let me know down in the comments what you thought of this reading. If you have any questions about this book, if it's something that you'd be interested in reading, do you want to know more? And if you have read it, feel free to comment on your thoughts on the book down below. But again, no spoilers for those who have not read this book. On that note, happy reading. May you be inspired, and I will hope to see you in my next video.